if we have an FDA indication, if we have essentially an FDA approval, then what we might see are clinics, hospitals that might be using psilocybin across the country. And, if psilocybin can indeed be helpful for people who are, say, smoking and would like to stop, or using cocaine and they'd like to stop, or people who are dealing with depression or end-of-life distress, it would be wonderful if this treatment paradigm was made available to them.
This is Meredith for Real, the Curious Introvert, and I'm Meredith. I explore the questions people think but don't ask out loud, either because they're taboo or thanks to cultural hypnosis. My mission, and yours if you choose to accept it, is to inspire curiosity by exploring the nuance and paradox of our world. Each episode is different, so bring your ADD and your earbuds and have a look around. Hey Curiositors, it's me, Meredith. There seems to be a renaissance of interest in psychedelics lately, and I've been working for quite a while to bring you an episode about its therapeutic potential. Imagine my delight when I was introduced to someone who's actually on the government-funded team to research this. And I enjoyed this episode not just because I got to talk about psychedelics, but also because I can't remember any other guest that I debated. I mean, it was like a baby debate. It's 13 minutes in. If you're into it, I'd love to hear your take on what we talked about there. How's that for a hook? We obviously covered the potential use of psilocybin for treating addiction, but in the last 10 minutes, we also dove into what he calls betterment of well people, and what I called, how can we help Kevin not be an asshole? If you end up loving this episode, you'll also like the one I did with a psychedelic lawyer. It's episode 101. And if you are a repeat listener, a fellow curiositor, thank you so much for coming back. There are a jillion podcasts out there supported by big fancy networks and huge teams. So the fact that you press play on my little indie show, it actually does mean a lot. And if that is you, I want to invite you to participate in a fun promo I'm running for November 2022. Your name will be entered into a weekly drawing for a Meredith for Real beanie when you draft an Apple Podcast review, screenshot it, submit it, and send the screenshot to me. If you've already left a review, or you're like me, you don't have an iPhone, you can leave the review on the Good Pods app or on my Facebook page. I'll be drawing every week, and the reviews really help me prove that I have an engaged audience when I pitch busy, in high demand guests. And finally, if you're new here, welcome. Around here, we press play to get curious, disrupt the algorithm, and grow into better humans. We talk about everything from food addiction to friendship. So bring your ADD and your earbuds and have a look around. There's no specific order to listen to episodes. All right, enjoy the show. What if there was a solution for society's most chronic problems, namely mental health and addiction? And what if that solution were growing in a field out of a pile of cow poop? I'm talking about psilocybin, or more commonly called magic mushrooms. Psilocybin was approved for research of therapeutic potential in 2021, and my next guest is part of that research. He's a clinical psychologist and professor in the Department of Health Behaviors at University of Alabama, Birmingham. Today, he's going to share why the little fungi with so much potential has such a bad rap, what happens when a person takes it, and what the research is showing for potential wellness. California to Alabama, psychedelic scientist, botanical behavioralist, Dr. Peter Hendricks. Thanks for being here.
That was a great introduction. That was the best introduction I've heard to date. That was wonderful.
Well, thank you. Well, you deserve it. I'm really excited about what you have going on. I am surprised, however, that you had to go from California to Alabama to study magic mushrooms. That seems like an unlikely statement.
You would think so. I mean, many people have said the same thing, and I was in San Francisco before moving to Alabama. I'm not from California. I'm a DC area native, but you would think that California would have been more inviting, but at the time that I was interested in this, it wasn't. And some of my colleagues at UCSF, that's the University of California, San Francisco, where I was a postdoc, suggested that perhaps it would be better if I went to a more conservative part of the state, only because if we had done psychedelic work in San Francisco, then we may have played into some stereotypes that people hold about not just California, but San Francisco in general. And, noting that my office at the time was only a few blocks from the famous Haight-Ashbury district. So I think there was some concern that we would have just played along very nicely with stereotypes around San Francisco and the Haight-Ashbury district, and it would be better if I did this work where it would be least expected. So there is an advantage to that. I think there's an advantage to surprising people. There's an advantage to perhaps flying under the radar, because ultimately when I say we, the scientists who are doing this work, we just want to do the science and nothing more. It's always fun to interact with media like we are today, though the objective here on our part is not to gain a following. I don't have any social media accounts or to be mentioned in media reports. The objective here is to do the science as best we can and interrogate this question: is psilocybin therapeutic? Might psilocybin have anti-addictive properties? And we really want to know the answer to that question in a very objective way. It may not. We'd like to know one way or the other.
And that's the beauty of science, is leading with that critical mind, that questioning, curiosity, but also suspicion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, you could even argue that the best candidates to do this type of work would be those who are especially skeptical, because you do find something in science known as allegiance bias. The idea being, if I'm allied with my hypothesis, I'm more likely to find results that support it, whereas one who is not is less likely to do so. So if we really want to put psilocybin to the test, we likely at some point want some skeptical people collecting the data, because if even they find that psilocybin is indeed safe and effective, then we have a stronger argument to support our cause, given what I've just said about allegiance bias. But I think that also means that ultimately science is apolitical. It wouldn't. I see no reason why, in the case of psilocybin, it would be an issue of the left or the right. Though I realize that historically psychedelics are likely associated with the left. But in terms of just doing science, doing good science, and in this case, asking questions around whether psilocybin could help people who are addicted to, say, tobacco or cocaine, help them stopping using tobacco or cocaine, then there's no reason why anybody or everybody wouldn't want to be on board. So it doesn't matter that I'm in Alabama, California, or anywhere else. I think everybody can get behind the work that we're doing, especially since there's no political agenda whatsoever. That said, Birmingham is generally thought of as a blue dot in a red sea. Our mayor was handpicked by Bernie Sanders' Our Revolution initiative. The remaining parts of Alabama tend to be very libertarian in nature, which I think is good. So I think everybody in the state generally is supportive. There's no one, as far as I know, who'd like me to stop. And I think a big reason for that is many people have been impacted by addiction, and many people realize that we need better treatments. And the only objective of this work is to see if we might have a better treatment on our hands.
I agree.
So the reason why that would be, I think, politically sensational. I think it's very straightforward.
I don't think there, in a perfect world, there should be as much pushback on asking questions that maybe go against, a popular viewpoint. But I want to go back to history, because you mentioned historically, psychedelics have been associated with a more liberal stance and perspective of the world. A researcher, for those that don't know, Timothy Leary, is someone that he experimented with magic mushrooms, but not always with consent on his subjects, and, was rumored to use coercion. And that certainly contributed to the prohibition of psilocybin. But the development of birth control also included the use of coercion and deception with women in Puerto Rico. And yet we accept birth control as generally safe and accepted in our society. So what is it about psilocybin that makes it not just illegal, but taboo?
That's a really good question. I've opined on that issue in public spheres, but I don't really know. I'm a psychologist. I'm not a historian. I think different people might have different perspectives here. But what I can tell you is this. Humans, as far as we know, have likely used psilocybin or mushrooms that contain psilocybin for many thousands of years. or at least we find evidence that humans first used psilocybin-containing mushrooms 20,000 years ago or longer. And when the Spanish arrived in the New World in modern-day Mexico, it would appear that this practice would have been fairly common among the indigenous people of modern-day Mexico, but that the Spanish found it to be problematic from the perspective of the Catholic tradition, and that practice was generally stamped out. And by the 20th century, the Western world had generally forgotten all about this practice and had forgotten all about these mushrooms. And it wasn't until R. Gordon Wasson, I hate to use the term discover,
right?
But it wasn't until R. Gordon Wasson, who was an amateur banker, a Westerner and a white man, made contact with Maria Sabina, the famous indigenous healer, that the Western world was reintroduced to these mushrooms that were being used by Maria in very sacred healing contexts in the Mexican state of Oaxaca. And Maria would have been someone who kept that candle aflame, you might say, who had carried on that tradition that was likely in place for generations. But at the time, again, the Western world had largely forgotten all about this. And in fact, many of the anthropological finds that might allude to mushroom use were thought to, in fact, be references to the peyote cactus, which might resemble the cap of a mushroom, you could argue. Now, what's interesting, Meredith, is that R. Gordon Wasson, his adventures, his trips to Mexico appear to have been bankrolled, at least in part, by the CIA.
Oh, really?
May or may not have known this. It's hard to know. But the CIA was very interested in finding novel chemical compounds that could be weaponized or used for interrogation. So my guess is that when R. Gordon Wasson discovered, I use that term loosely, say discovered for the Western world, psilocybin, that the CIA had a very keen interest in how it might be used for their own purposes. Now, LSD later became of much greater interest to not only the CIA, but the Western world, including Timothy Leary, who was introduced to psilocybin mushrooms himself during a vacation in Mexico. But when he discovered LSD, I think he largely left psilocybin behind. And I think Timothy Leary, for as brilliant as he was, and he really was brilliant and charismatic, and I enjoy watching old clips of Timothy Leary because he was such a skilled and entertaining storyteller. But I can only guess as to his motivation. But I think he had long decided that he would move on from being a scientist and perhaps be something of an evangelist. I think he felt that psychedelics could really change the way humans interact with one another. And I think his own sense was that if more people have these mystical type experiences, which are often characterized by this feeling that we're all one, we're all in this together, our fates are intertwined. It's a very powerful message that there could be a new era of peace and prosperity on the planet. And I don't blame him for feeling that way, right? Perhaps if each and every one of us, if the billions of us who inhabited this planet realized that we would be much more successful if we cooperated with one another, if we saw one another as all part of the human family, then many of our most pressing problems, from warfare to famine to economic disparity, could be addressed. I don't disagree with that idea. I'm just not entirely sure that one, we could ensure that everyone on the planet has a psychedelic experience, or the sort of psychedelic experience that we have in mind. So not everybody will use the substance, and not everybody who uses the substance will have this experience in which all is one. Sometimes those feelings of connection extend only to your tribe, and that could lead to this sort of entrenched nationalism or tribalism that is still a major problem to this date. But I don't blame Timothy Leary for feeling the way he did. And that message was, I suppose, internalized by the countercultural left at the time, who were really pushing for civil rights here and were pushing against the Vietnam War abroad. And I think that philosophy or that political orientation and the message that Timothy Leary was spreading, they worked well together at the time, right? So if the message from psychedelics is we're all one, our fates are intertwined, it would make sense that a countercultural generation in which the message was we don't need to be fighting people in Vietnam, nor do we need to be committing ourselves to the acquisition of wealth at the expense of others. And in fact, everyone in this country should have civil rights. The fact that these two messages aligned makes sense. So I think for that reason, psychedelics became strongly associated with that counterculture. And you asked, why then would psilocybin have the bad rap or the reputation it has to this day? I think in part because it was associated with that counterculture, which certainly would not have been mainstream by any stretch of the imagination. It probably would have been quite revolutionary at the time. I wasn't there. I don't really know. I can only imagine.
That's the best we can do. Well, I could see where, people who want to fit in, follow the rules, and then, the government makes it illegal. I think from that perspective, there's always a sense of tabooness first of all, because prohibition never works, right? Like, when has it ever worked? So that alone makes something.
I think it does.
You think prohibition works? Okay. Seriously? Tell me. I want to hear.
Well, it depends what you mean by work. If you look back at the period of time where we had the prohibition of alcohol, from what we can tell, deaths related to cirrhosis of the liver decreased by maybe as much as a third.
Okay, that's not what I consider working. I consider working mean people stop it. Like, from what I have learned, anytime something's like, don't look at that, don't eat the fruit on the tree, don't touch this drug, then it makes people want, even the banned books right now, English teachers everywhere are celebrating about these banned books because the children, there's like a resurgence in wanting to read the books because they're banned. That's what I mean. From that perspective.
Yeah, usually when you try to control someone's liberty, right? they will push back and they will show you that in fact they are in control of their own lives, sometimes by doing the exact opposite of what you're telling them to do. So I think we're saying the same thing. I do agree that heavy-handed or draconian approaches to control people's behavior are not effective, although I would say it's certainly effective if you limit one's access to a given drug or substance. So, for instance, if we made smoking illegal tomorrow, I can guarantee our annual smoking deaths would plummet. But some people would still smoke, and then I think we could ask some serious questions around whether it is respectful of others' liberty to simply tell them they can no longer smoke.
And how are we measuring deaths? I know we're kind of getting on a rabbit trail here, but this is fun. Sure. This is fun. So how are we measuring deaths? So if you're measuring deaths by direct causation of smoking and that goes down, great. But what if we include the death count of people who participate in the black market of the sale of those cigarettes and they die as a result of seeking them? So it might be a wash.
I think you're right. And anybody who has studied drug policy would tell you, if you liberalize your drug laws, the drug will be more accessible, more people will use it. And as a consequence, more people will become dependent, and there will likely be an increase in drug-related deaths. It would be hard to see that in the case of psychedelics because they are quite safe, but there would be some mishaps, I'm sure.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up because that's the perfect segue to these government agencies. I was researching what do these official agencies say on their website? So on the DEA fact sheet, the official DEA fact sheet says psilocybin may cause death. Fun. Super fun. The NIH website says, quote, of all the psychedelic drugs, psilocybin is reported to have the most favorable safety profile. So has anyone ever died of a psilocybin overdose?
That would be very hard to pull off. I think I read recently, and this gave me a good laugh, that the overdose from psilocybin, like a overdose caused directly from psilocybin, is a theoretical possibility, though it would require that one consume an epic amount of mushrooms.
Epic.
So consider this. a very large dose, as I understand it from my readings of Terence McKenna and others, a very large dose would be 5 grams of dried mushroom material. I think that's what Terence McKenna referred to as a heroic dose, 5 grams. The other source indicated that to overdose on psilocybin directly, one would have to consume about 25 to 30 pounds of dried mushroom mat. And so to put that in perspective, if you go to a steakhouse and you see on the wall pictures of usually men who've eaten these huge steaks, they usually look like they play offensive line for an NFL team. They're 6'6", 300 pounds. I think those steaks are usually, 3 or 4 pounds. So, a gigantic human being might be able to eat 3 or 4 pounds of steak if they really commit themselves to it. I don't think anyone's going to be eating 25 pounds of mushrooms. It just wouldn't be possible.
Oh,
so I don't know anybody who has, but, Meredith, anything we ever do ever carries risk. Everything. There have been some endurance athletes who've overdosed on water. You can drink too much water. There have been people who have died from drinking too much water, but we all have water in our homes and we use it all the time. Exercise also confers certain risks. There are people who die exercising every day on the floors of gyms, running, cycling. It's tragic, of course, but that is a risk that one accepts when they engage in physical activity. There are risks associated with driving, with using electronic devices. There's nothing that we'll ever do that doesn't confer some degree of risk. And the idea is, as adults, we're able to weigh the pros and cons and make decisions on our own. So psilocybin would be remarkably safe. Yes. Is it without any risk at all? I would say no, but nothing is. And certainly somebody could have an experience that would be very intense, that would be panic inducing, that might cause them to engage in behavior that would endanger them. So, somebody could use without any preparation, without really understanding what the drug does in a public setting, have a strong panic reaction and, run out into traffic. That could happen. And there have been anecdotal reports of people throwing themselves off the roof of buildings. I think that's something of a trope in the psychedelic world, but I think it has happened before. And when someone's disoriented and unaware of their surroundings and panicking, obviously dangerous things can happen. But these sort of mishaps are very rare. And of course, when they do happen, the media tends to report them because they're novel. They don't happen very often. They're sensational. They certainly lead to clicks. But if all the media did was, say, report alcohol-related deaths or smoking-related deaths, that's all we see on our computer screens all day long. So we tend not to think much about the risks of alcohol and smoking or tobacco, 2 drugs that are widely available, legal, and commercialized. And yet if we hear just one report of Meredith thinking she could fly and jumping off a building, then we begin to think, whoa, psilocybin is really dangerous. It does confer risk without a doubt, but relatively speaking, it's quite safe. So, the question is, why would it be illegal? I think the reasons are primarily political. I think Richard Nixon or perhaps others, it's hard to say, wanted to bring an end to this counterculture. And they felt that the psychedelic, primarily LSD, but the psychedelics were fueling that countercultural revolution. So I often say it's as though, like at the end of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, they placed psychedelics in a wooden box and they nailed the box shut, and then they filed it away in a warehouse somewhere, hoping everyone will forget all about this and we'll never have to think about it again. And this counterculture will go away. I don't think it ever did. Strangely enough, there was a period of time in the 90s during the Clinton administration that psychedelic use was in fact quite high. So I think we had something of a silent countercultural revolution during that time. But the scientific or medical rationale for placing these substances in Schedule I was very limited and weak.
And some would say we're having a psychedelic resurgence of interest now. And I think that is, on the pop culture side, what makes the research that you're doing so interesting. But on the mental health side, it makes it very intriguing because it gives us hope. And as you've already established, psilocybin is safe, and you wanted to point out it's also effective a lot of the time, but it's not magical. So with that kind of disclaimer safely buckled in place, can you share any of the success stories or, moments of hope for bigger use that you found with psilocybin? Hey, Curiositors, just a quick pause to show gratitude to our sponsors and give you some special deals. If you ever wonder where I find guests for the show, the answer is it varies a lot. And since it's something that gets asked a lot, I started including the backstory of each episode in my Monday emails. And then on Saturday, I share cliff notes and clickable links in case what you heard was so good you wish you could have taken notes. If you want to be included, text REAL to 66866 if you're in the US, or go to meredithforreal.com if you're elsewhere. If you've got backyard barbecue plans for 2022, but mosquitoes are not invited, I recommend Insect. I've been using their pest control service for several years now. They have a certified mosquito identification specialist on staff, and pollinator care is always top of mind. If you live in the Florida Panhandle or the Gulf Coast of Alabama, give them a call, ensec.net. If you watch the show on YouTube, then you see the beautiful backdrop of Trader John's, the exhibit where I record the show inside the Pensacola Museum of History. This is just one museum under the umbrella of the UWF Historic Trust. If you're planning a trip to Pensacola and need an indoor activity option, pick up a ticket. It's good for a whole week. Get your tickets in person so you can show the agent one of my emails and get $2 off an adult ticket. Now back to the show. Remember to stay till the end where I give you a sneak peek of next week's episode.
Well, first, okay, so I would say, and by the way, cut me off if I talk too much. As you've seen, I can just ramble.
Okay, fair.
So it appears to be quite safe, I think, especially when used in very carefully controlled context. Okay. Now, when I say that, often what some people take from that is I'm telling them that they cannot use psychedelics unless they do so in a medical context with support and supervision. That's not what I'm saying. People are free to do whatever they choose. I think the ideal context, however, is one in which you've prepared for the experience, often with a trained mental health professional, and then you are then administered that substance in a setting with appropriate medical support. In our case, with nurses just outside the room and a physician on call in the event that there are any unforeseen or potentially anticipated medical emergencies that we expect to be quite rare. I'm very content with that paradigm, and I think that is one in which we can maximize safety and also maximize the therapeutic efficacy, because there is a big difference between, say, eating a handful of mushrooms without much preparation at, let's say, a fish show. And I'm not picking on fish. I've seen fish many times. I'm a fish fan myself. But there's a big difference between eating a handful of mushrooms, maybe somewhat impulsively at a fish show, standing in a stadium of strangers, and working with a therapist prior to your drug administration day, discussing your intentions, focusing on a specific area of mental health that you would like to address, perhaps improve, and then having a calm and comforting experience with these same two therapists there at your side to ensure you feel prepared to surrender to this experience, and that you're in a safe place that requires you do nothing but dive inward. After which you then discuss your experience with that same therapist and ideally translate any insights you have into concrete behavior change. Okay, so that's a very safe way to do things. Now, you said effective. We don't know definitively, right? And I think that much of the public is a much better consumer of science after this COVID pandemic, in part because we now understand a little bit about how vaccines are developed. If I told you that we've tested a vaccine on 100 people and it appears to be safe and effective, you might say, wait a second, wouldn't you want to enroll many more people than only 100? And I would say absolutely yes. So the studies that have been conducted to date, the rigorous modern studies on psilocybin, have been generally limited in sample size. In some cases, there haven't been control conditions. The data are very promising, but are we at the point yet where we've conducted several very large studies with appropriate placebo controls where we can definitively say psilocybin is effective? I would say no. I would say no. However, the effect sizes appear to be so large that many people are willing to get ahead of themselves and say, this is effective. It seems pretty obvious. And again, I wouldn't blame them for feeling that way, but I would say technically we're not there yet. Your next question, the future. Well, if we have an FDA indication, if we have essentially an FDA approval, then what we might see are clinics, hospitals that might be using psilocybin across the country. And, if psilocybin can indeed be helpful for people who are, say, smoking and would like to stop, or using cocaine and they'd like to stop, or people who are dealing with depression or end-of-life distress, it would be wonderful if this treatment paradigm was made available to them. And I think what we need to start thinking about now is how we can actually make that work, considering that this is a very time-intensive intervention, as I indicated. It requires a lot of resources, a lot of time, and often the time of highly skilled people, which is very likely going to render it very expensive. So will managed care, or will the insurance companies be willing to reimburse for all this time and expertise? And I hope the answer is yes, because if not, then we'll have what we have in general with ketamine clinics, which is these are available only to people who can pay out of pocket. But that's really not going to work. And, increasingly those of lower income are really, bearing the burden of mental health or mental illness. And I think we would really be shooting ourselves in the foot if we had some situation in which only very wealthy people could access this treatment. So I think that's something we need to think about right now. How are we going to make this affordable?
That is a good question, because the application of a brilliant treatment if it's not accessible, then, it's all for nothing, right? So success stories. So have you had any stories of research or cases that would make this exciting to the average listener who's maybe psychedelic naive?
So some anecdotes.
Sure.
I have to be, I'll be careful about what I say. I just want to ensure that I'm, protecting everyone's privacy and confidentiality in the study.
Sure. And you can do it in the form of data. If you feel more comfortable with that form of storytelling, you could say, 30% of the people who had X problem experienced relief, or, if that's more comfortable for confidentiality boundaries.
Well, I'll say this. We haven't yet finished data collection. We were asked to look at our first 10 participants. We're collecting data on 40 participants. So we looked at the first 10, and our hypotheses were supported, and this should be taken with a grain of salt because the sample size was only 10. But even at a sample size of 10, we very clearly saw that those who were randomized to psilocybin reported more abstinent days, so greater abstinence, cocaine abstinence, than those who were randomized to receive the placebo. And that's really saying quite a bit, because everybody in the study is quite motivated, right? They have to tell us at the beginning that they want to stop using cocaine once and for all and never use again. They have to complete a physical. They have to come to a number of preparation sessions. So they have to be very committed to the notion of quitting. And so even in a sample where everyone was really committed to stopping their use of cocaine once and for all, we saw an effect of psilocybin, which I think is really interesting. But I think the anecdotal stories often just carry more weight. So for the psychedelic naive, the question is, well, what exactly is happening here? Often people have experiences that open their minds to some sort of novel insights or thoughts that could serve as motivation to commit themselves to abstaining or sobriety once and for all. And I think these experiences are very much like that of the fictional character Ebenezer Scrooge on Christmas Eve. That's a great analogy I've found time and again. And if we remember Ebenezer, he thought back to his earlier days. He remembered things he hadn't thought about in years. He had some insight around his pursuit of wealth and how it had affected relationships that meant a lot to him then. He had some insight around how his pursuit of money was affecting the people in his life that day, and perhaps some insights around how he might be remembered after he's gone if he didn't change his ways. And after that experience, he was really committed to changing himself, to being more oriented toward others, to caring more about others, and not committing himself only to a life of miserly pursuit of wealth. And people can have the same sort of experiences with psilocybin and cocaine. So I can think, for instance, of one participant who was using nearly every day when we first saw her. And when she had her psilocybin experience, she said that she was able to see her life told like a frieze, which is like a work of art you'd often see at the top of a Greek or Roman temple. And it would tell a story, the beginning, middle, and end, all at once, but in pictures. So you can see the story all at once, but you can read it from left to right. She said that she was able to see her life like one of these frescoes. She could see where she was today, but she was able to follow back in time a path and identify a moment in time that impacted her life and put her on this path of cocaine use. And in her eyes, it was having been sexually abused as a child and blaming herself for that instance and using cocaine as a way to self-medicate and to escape or avoid her feelings of shame and hurt and sadness that were associated with that experience. She said that in that moment, she traveled back in time and confronted that young version of herself. So here she is as an adult, and she confronts this young version of herself and hugs this young version of herself and tells her, this was not your fault, and you don't need to go down this path. You don't need to go down this path of cocaine use as a way of masking your feelings of shame and sadness and horror at what happened to you. You need to be compassionate toward yourself, and using cocaine is not how you're going to show compassion for yourself. You need to take a different path. You need to take the path of sobriety. And she said in that moment, it's as though that younger version of herself then took a new path, leading her to where she was that day. And when her experience was over, she was able to say, I'm not a user anymore.
Oh my gosh.
I'm not going to use. I'm going to, and a big thing for her was, I'm going to be compassionate toward myself. I'm not going to blame myself for the awful things that have happened to me. I'm going to show myself some kindness. And part of that means not using cocaine. And she, for the duration of her time in the study, which was nearly another 7 months, never used cocaine again.
Wow. That's incredible. I mean, that's a transformative moment. And,
yes.
And the fact that, she struggled for so long to reach that place and then was able to reach it with the help of psilocybin, I could see where I really hope that more people could have that. In what I've read, the potential use cases use wording like treatment resistant, fill in the blank, like treatment resistant depression, right. or end of life care, or really extreme diagnoses. And this just could be me, so bear with me, but could we just use it for like making people realize they should not be an asshole? Like, like, does it always have to be, like this dramatic, I've tried everything and now I'm going to try some mushrooms. Like, yes. Can't it just be, could it ever be normalized to be a better citizen? Like a person realizes they're kind of a jackass and they're like, God, I don't know how to not be a jackass. What do I do about that? I don't want to go to talk therapy. I did that as a teenager and, but obviously talk therapy is a part of sitting with mushrooms in many cases, in the most beneficial cases. But, can we study that?
That's a great question. Okay. So Meredith, very insightful. You've absolutely done your homework. I'm not just saying this because I'm here right now. You're asking. Not only did you have the best introduction, you're asking some of the best questions I've had, and I've had so many. It is so nice to get some new ones and to talk with someone who's really done their homework.
Well, thanks.
Let me say this. I think it is strategic. It is politically strategic in many ways to study psilocybin first with treatment-resistant depression or end-of-life distress, because there is that heightened political lens around psilocybin and psychedelics in general. I think the thought was that there'd be less resistance in conducting this research if we were doing so in populations where nothing has worked anyway. Okay, so I, like many others, have people I know and love who are very conservative. And I think their voices deserve to be heard. I think we could talk about maybe even the role that psilocybin could play in political polarization.
Yes.
We are extraordinarily polarized now to the point where we have to fall into one of two camps, and you generally despise those who are in the other camp. You disagree with everything they say, and you refuse to have a discussion with them. I disagree with that. I think we should have discussions with each other. We should be open to talking about our feelings. And if someone expresses some concern, some hesitation around psychedelics, their voices deserve to be heard. I think if, say, one of my conservative loved ones had said, look, this is really wild. You're using a drug that we know to be, according to the DEA, say, dangerous and addictive to treat a mental health condition. Perhaps my response to them could be, I hear you. I think if we took a good look at the history there, we'd find that there really wasn't a scientific rationale for that designation. However, would you be open to at least giving this a try in a population of people for whom nothing has worked yet, right? So what do we have to lose here? And I think that's often been the strategy. Let's start with some of these populations because we can say we don't have much to lose. And I appreciate that. I think Matt's strategy in that regard was really quite brilliant, to say these are people with treatment-resistant PTSD. It's debilitating. Nothing has worked for them. In many cases, they are combat veterans or first responders. We can all get behind trying to find something that might work, even if it sounds a little crazy. We might be willing to do this because nothing has worked, and we really care about this population of people. We will get to the point, yes, where we will be studying a range of conditions, I think, not just those that fall into that category of, well, nothing has worked anyway. But the question is whether we could get to the point of what I think you're arguing for here, which is the betterment of well people.
Yes,
Okay,
because we get forgotten, by the way. Like when we go to the doctor and you're establishing primary care, the doctor looks at me and goes, "Why are you here?" And I'm like, I thought I was supposed to establish primary care. And, you know, if I do get sick, it's nice to like have a person. But I do have these other things I'd like to talk to you about to increase my vitality. It's like if the floor could open up underneath me and they could drop me back into the parking lot at the moment I said increase my vitality, they totally would. So I am excited, and, you know, I do hope for a way that people like me can engage in, you know, higher levels of homeostasis without having to have a long list of symptoms that match up with pharmaceutical, you know, solutions.
So the problem there is when you develop a drug, from the FDA's perspective, there has to be an indication.
Yeah.
Right? So you are developing this drug, what for? There has to be a diagnosis. We can't say, look at Meredith, is very healthy, happy, and high functioning, but we think we can improve her functioning further. They would say she needs diagnosis.
Okay,
you need
so
a diagnosis that you're essentially attacking here, that you're trying to address. And in clinical practice, if you have an insurance company that's going to reimburse me for the treatment I provide you, I have to give you a diagnosis. If I'm going to provide my treatment to you, it has to be for something, and there's no diagnosis for what we would essentially call positive psychology, like the betterment of well people.
Right.
So that is in many ways an issue of the healthcare industry, and it would likely require that you pay out of pocket unless we get really creative with our reimbursement with insurance companies.
Yeah, well, I do pay out of pocket, so I'm fine with that. It's just
you're
the accent.
You're fine paying out of pocket? Then I think it's perfectly reasonable for someone to say, yeah, I'm doing well, but I would like to have this experience as a matter of curiosity or exploration. And the data would clearly indicate that otherwise healthy people become even more pro-social after these experiences. They become kinder, gentler, warmer than they were before. So I think you'd have an argument for that.
Yeah.
The tricky part would be getting an insurance company to reimburse for that care. I don't think that would happen to date. But if you're willing to pay out of pocket, that wouldn't be a problem.
Yeah. Well,
I think a physician would be willing to do that.
Well, that is very hopeful. So we are running out of time, which is tragic. But before, wow. I know it's gone by so fast. I love this topic, and you have such great energy around the enthusiasm and the research and the data and the history. So yeah, thank you so much.
What did we miss? Were there any really important questions
yes.
we need to hit on? I'll be quick.
Okay. Yeah. This is my hot question is the FDA historically loves to push through drugs that require lifelong taking them forever. There is financial benefit for parties involved to have the approval of drugs that are for your lifetime, long term. So what are the chances that the FDA would approve a treatment like psilocybin that within 1 or 2 sessions, this person is completely freed from having to take not only any more psilocybin, but potentially they are also freed from taking other drugs that were previously prescribed as lifelong, like depression meds or something.
I don't think the FDA would have any problem with that. I don't.
You really think not?
My opinion is that no. I think that my colleagues at FDA are scientists. I think they're very committed to what they do. I think they are committed to the amelioration of suffering. I have no reason to think that they would have any misgivings about this treatment paradigm. I know people have mentioned this before. Would this be potentially a threat to the pharmaceutical industry that makes money or might be incentivized to promote these paradigms that require daily medication use? Perhaps it would make sense, but I just haven't seen any pushback myself. Maybe somebody else will have a different opinion, but I'm not concerned there. I think that the FDA, if the data indicate that psilocybin is indeed safe and effective, will have no problem essentially. I don't know if approve is quite the right word, but we'll just use that for now. Approving psilocybin for those purposes, because there are a lot of people out there, sadly, a lot of people who are suffering from mental health conditions, and psilocybin won't be for everybody, right? Not everybody will respond to it. That's something that's important to keep in mind. For all the hype that we've seen in the media, not everybody will respond to it. A number of people won't. People will come in with very high hopes, but a lot of people will not respond to it. It won't work for everybody, which means there need to be other options for them. And I think that antidepressants have certainly helped many people, but they don't work for everybody. So I think the idea here is that we're trying to have as many options available to people as possible. The hope is that psilocybin could be one of them. But, if we just describe what happens when one uses psilocybin, that on that basis alone, a number of people would not be interested. And so I don't think there's much of a threat. Whether that's good or bad, I would guess you would say that's probably bad, that it's not a threat to the pharmaceutical system. But I think there will be many millions of people who prefer the, say, SSRI treatment modality.
Well, sure. There'll be always people, as long as people are free to have the choice and the economic aspects to those choices are equal, then I don't think that's a totally bad thing. As we wrap, I know you wanted to give a shout out to a special organization, IPCI. Can you go ahead and share that?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll just say the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative is a group that is committed to helping Indigenous people conserve the peyote cactus and promote stewardship and education. And if you go to their website, icpi.life, you can learn a bit more about what they do. I think it's a very worthy organization and one that would certainly appreciate the donations from your listeners. So please go to that website, ipci.life, and take a look. I am not associated with ipci.life at all. So this is just an organization, I think, that could use a bit more press.
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was a fantastic conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you've loved a couple episodes of the show, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or the Good Pods app. If you liked this episode, you'll also like the one I did with the psychedelic lawyer. It's episode 101. Stay tuned next week when I talk with one of America's few native archaeologists.